Hey y'all, so new episode here, baseball card philosophy. It's kind of more baseball history and philosophy. The idea here, I think this will be a bit more of like a video essay or like a lecture style type of deal. I think the thing to go after, and I've been circling this for a while in my studies and my research, is the kind of the history of baseball, the labor history of baseball, right? And how there's an entire ecosystem that you can see through the lens of baseball that maps out the larger social, political, and economic condition of American history. I mean, this is a huge topic, right? So I think the idea for this essay is to just kind of keep it very narrow and focus on my specialty of research is like 1909 to 1916, small window of dead ball, which for me is kind of like the height of it. And the reason it's the height of it is because there is a very rapid and significant shift in the way that American culture itself functions and works. And this is the um, real industrial age, right? I mean, obviously, you have the innovations that allow for the mechanization of crop production in the country in the 1800s. But you're still living in a very kind of agrarian, pre-modern world, but globally, really, before the jump into the 20th century and the springing up of factory towns, tenement housing in New York City. These are all very sudden developments that characterize modernity. Through the lens of baseball, you have the primary American cultural export of the late 1800s and early 1900s. I mean, by far, right? Hollywood doesn't really hit until the 30s and 40s and 50s. And by then, we're already in baseball's golden age, which I consider transparently, just honestly, it's already declining at that point for a lot of reasons. But this period that I'm focusing on, there are a couple of different really valuable insights that actually come from the players themselves. And the biggest issue in dead ball was financial, economic. Right? You have players who, really not unlike today in African American culture. There's this idea that people like Ed Walsh, for instance, um, who else am I going to name? Stan Kovaleski. There are players that have been directly quoted. These are players that grew up in mining towns, right? They grew up in coal towns, right? Christy Mathewson is another one of them. These are players who grew up. Mickey Mantle, I think, is really one of the last great American cultural heroes whose background is in mining, right? Walter Johnson with farming. These are working class heroes of American history, and they're the earliest cultural icons that emerge in American history, beyond political figures like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. And there's it's there's a lot to examine there. Um, the idea of baseball as a working class pastime, of course, is something that has shifted very recently in a modern context just due to the vast differences that are occurring in American history and have been occurring since the end of the Second World War. Um, in the dead ball era, there is a very, very specific breach that occurs and is occurring because baseball is becoming America's pastime, right? This is a game that kind of rose out of the mud of like common playing fields, and in the course of doing so, um, catches on, right, through magazines like Harper's Weekly, right, the institution of the AL and the NL, the AL at the turn of the century. Um, Players that foster that development, like Cap Anson and Cy Young, um, being among them, it becomes. Then this is a whole different conversation of how it actually becomes the pastime itself. But as it does, right? There's some great images perhaps that I can show here if I can find them, of the crowds at these early World Series games. It's truly something profound, right? I have an image, maybe I'll be able to pull it up, of Shibe Park at the 1910 World Series. I mean, this is a crowd that stretches back really as far as the eye can see on these risers. Um, this is something that is I'm kind of looking it up as I'm talking. That is an infatuation um, that America has, right? And so here, I got it right here. So much of the media exports of this time in history are around baseball. This is why 1909 to 1916 is so crucial, because what we're dealing with, let me see if I can find a good way to do this. I will just pull it up. What we're dealing with is the collision of media institution, which is the technology of photography, right? Which is the technology of videography, which is the subtle and very, very, very quick moving, fast moving nationalization of media and information through photojournalism circuits, news circuits, and eventually wire photography, as well as the globalization of information, perhaps no more aptly summed up than in World War One. Right? That's really one of the first moments that you can really point to and say this is the globalization of information through really a direct physical encounter. Right there, the industrialization of America is inseparable from the industrialization and globalization of the world at large, and this is a large part of what Deadball itself is dealing with. This is not something that is occurring in a vacuum, right? This is something, Deadball itself, I got you with this photo here. Deadball itself, look at that, just see how far back that those risers are stretching, right? And this is early America. There's not a big population in the country at the time. I mean, I could pull up the specific numbers, but the population changes have been drastic since this moment in time. What we're dealing with Deadball and why it's so powerful is that it's America's cultural institution in real time encountering two factors: industrialization and globalization, and the economic tensions that occur through that. Precisely because of the culture of baseball itself. During this period of time, obviously, Christy Mathewson is an anomaly, right, in the sense that he's the icon of like the college boy or the American ideal of baseball. But in reality, most of the players that emerged from this period, and even in the golden age, right, people like Lou Gehrig or the Dean brothers, Paul and Dizzy Dean, came from very, very poor families, poor immigrant families, or rural American second, third, fourth generation, fifth generation, etc. families that they grew up on like a corn farm, or they grew up in an environment like Gehrig did. I think pretty sure it was the Bronx in New York City, to an immigrant family that was just barely kind of scraping by. Gehrig becomes a facet of that scraping by very early on in his life. This is the tension that Deadball deals with, and you can see this through the early World Series games, right? Owners like Charles Ebbets, right? These business savvy, how to communicate this, business savvy, more titans of industry people, right? People who get early on in the process of globalization and industrialization due to previous accumulation of resources, family inheritances, etc. These people become the owners of baseball, right? Like literally the owners. And of course, one of the biggest parts, if not the biggest part, of dead ball, which defines it, in my opinion, is the Federal League, right? The institution creation of the Federal League, and really this because all the Federal League was, right, is that these Federal League owners, these are industrialists, very very rich upper class people in America that wanted in on the honeypot, so to speak, of baseball as it became America's pastime, and their movement was spearheaded in large part by the vast wealth inequalities that were present in baseball at the time. Players like Walter Johnson, Joe Tinker, Frank Chance, George Stovall being I think the most important because he was again the first and simultaneously one of the most notable and the first to move from the institution of baseball to the Federal League and recruited a lot of the players that would come later. You have people like Mordecai Brown, I think Chief Bender as well. This is a very important thing to understand in terms of baseball history because it defines everything that comes after. And it is the tension of everything before, in the sense that the people who defined the culture of baseball, for the most part in the modern age, were not respectable upper class, even middle class citizens. These were people who came from I don't know, salt of the earth circumstances, maybe is the word, or just really came from destitute lack of circumstances, so to speak. Whether that was industrial, right, factory or mining, what have you, in these kind of larger city centers, which defined early baseball, import-export centers like St. Louis, or they came from very, very rural America, again, very poor agrarian backgrounds, again, kind of the pre-modern roots of America, farms, right? So this is kind of what has been constellating for me, is that baseball is really is a labor history. I have a really, really, really nice letter. There's no need to go over it in too much detail. Describing George Stovall actually reporting for the first time to the Kansas City Packers, which is the Federal League team that he became the player manager of in 1914, right? It's spring of 1914, where he's actually reporting for the first time. This is kind of what is hidden and I think not discussed as much. There's a really great, I brought this up in one of the earlier videos, really great cover of Baseball Magazine, I think April 1915, with Walter Johnson. Walter Johnson actually signed to the Federal League for a huge contract at the time. I think it was like 50-something thousand dollars, which was a lot. And there were basically, what baseball would do is that they would buy these players back as soon as they signed. And this, of course, leads up to the trust lawsuits of the early 20s that kind of coincide with the Black Sox scandal of 1919. And actually, the guy who wrote that letter, I think Harry Neely is his name, actually played like a very institutional role with Ban Johnson researching that 1919 scandal. And again, the thing that combines these two markers at the end of the dead ball era, the Black Sox scandal, as well as the Federal League, are economic conditions, right? There's simply no reason to throw a game if you can make enough money or more than enough money to sustain yourself playing baseball. And this was the primary issue of the time, right? There's plenty of examples of this. Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb gambling, Heine Zimmerman gambling. Obviously, you have Shoeless Joe Jackson, Black Sox. This was Hal Chase as another good example. This was really the primary moral and ethical theme of the time. And of course, there was this idea in the fans' minds of baseball being this clean sport, but you have to reckon with the reality that these are people who, you have quotes from Ed Walsh and Stan Kovaleski. I'll bring them up again. They basically said, I experienced the mines, right, and I was just not going back to the mines, right? And a lot of the stuff that propelled these players to the level of greatness that they ended up achieving, right, both of those players obviously Hall of Fame caliber, is that they came from circumstances that pretty objectively are very difficult. And to them, they were not going to work, right? And baseball was a way out. Um, this is something that runs hand in hand with the Negro League history. It runs hand in hand with players that you see like Satchel Paige that become the mythic thread or the essence of baseball in the 30s and 40s and 50s. This common labor theme, right, again, is something that you see emerge later on with the Curt Flood appeal. You see this emerge obviously all the way up to the present day. And what has changed in baseball, I think fundamentally, is this player leverage that did not exist in dead ball. And it began with the Federal League. The Federal League was the first instance of players gaining leverage by way of a third league. A third league that was willing to pay them more and give them better living conditions. So this is the real underpinning of baseball as a culture. And so when you say the culture of baseball is different today, what we're talking about is an economic condition. It's a class condition underlying. And obviously you have integration in the 40s and 50s, but that still is very much so tied to the economic condition, right? It's inseparable. Most of the Negro Leagues teams, with the exception of a rare few, right, which house the absolute best players, like the Grays, like the Monarchs, etc., Birmingham. Most of those teams played in just absolute destitute conditions, right? The owners would not pay the players. They would just struggle to have places to play, right? There's some information out there in terms of these owners basically politely asking or even begging to rent out New York City, New York Yankees Stadium for games, right? Satchel Paige ended up playing a couple of those. So this is kind of the deeper layer in the substratum of what, circling back, really distinctly defines the dead ball era. You have kind of the titans of industry in the upper class of baseball who had both controlling interests and front row seats to this. And these players were, with risk of exaggerating perhaps, essentially gladiators in a rising kind of modern American civilizational construct where they were not paid anything, right? They were paid very little. They would all work jobs in the off season, and even so, those jobs would often make more money for them than baseball would. That's a cultural context, right? And so the shift of baseball over the past 120, 130 years is essentially solely subscribed to that, or you can subscribe it solely to that. Obviously, the institution of televised games, right, played a big part in the changes that happened. But player leverage in terms of the contracts that are handed out today can be brought all the way back to the Federal League. So the culture is something that's radically different, right? Because there simply isn't nearly as much then as there was now in terms of economic prosperity, particularly for these players. So when you look at the culture of baseball, right, through photography or through stories, you're looking at an era that existed in large part due to this crux, right? This moment of change, the agrarian early America and the modern industrial America, and this kind of line that hits right at World War One. It's a rise from 1909 with the institution of like press photography, things along those lines, right? You could say 1909, 1908. Industrial production just really, really, really hitting hard in America, right? The 10s, the 20s, obviously the 30s, right? You go forward on, it just becomes more exponential. That kind of industrial production defines the way that baseball goes, right? Because you obviously have in the 20s, right, the purchase of Babe Ruth's contract, the offloading of so many Boston players, the Red Sox players who defined the success of the 1910s, That has to do in large part with New York completing its claim, right? Not staking its claim, but completing its claim as the industrial media supercenter, not only of America, but the world, without exaggerating, right? And so when it does that, there's a large amount of concentration of wealth, political, social, economic power in the state of New York, in the city of New York. And thus, so much of what baseball is and does moves through New York City, right? I mean, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, baseball is New York City. It's the Brooklyn Dodgers, it's the New York Giants, and the New York Yankees, right? This is a battle for supremacy pretty much localized in the city of New York, with the exception of several very strong St. Louis Cardinals teams, right? Teams like that, Detroit Tigers. And it is no coincidence that St. Louis and Detroit were very, very important industrial and trading centers in America at that time, because this is the purchasing power that goes into how these teams are assembled, right? The owners of these teams are the industrial titans of this era of industry, right? They are the contributing factors, and of course, things like fan attendance, all of these different micro factors go into the purchasing success and purchasing power of these teams, right? And so again, today with the New York teams, this still holds true in large part, as well as Los Angeles and California. These are the epicenters of American industry, and thus the power, the organizational power flows through them, essentially, in baseball. This is really what this video is about, because you can see, right, Cleveland, St. Louis, Boston, Detroit, Pittsburgh, especially Pittsburgh, right, the Pirates with Honus Wagner, right, and the early pitching strength of like Vic Willis and these kinds of players. This shift happens right in that period, 1909 through 1916. It's a balance of power that's disrupted by the industrialization of America, that flows into, through, and finally culminates in New York City. What's lost, right, is these Cleveland teams, right, Shoeless Joe Jackson, the Chicago teams, Frank Chance, Joe Tinker, Mordecai Brown, Ed Walsh on the White Sox, right? And then obviously Shoeless Joe, Gandil, right? The balance of power is consolidated in New York. And you lose Cleveland, you lose St. Louis, you lose Detroit. And there's a reason that baseball is constellated on the eastern seaboard, in large part in the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, into the more rural, agrarian, industrial city centers of Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, because this is the way that America is politically structured in terms of its import, export, production, and industrial industry, whether it's farms or whether it's coal mines or whether it's factories. This is the underpinning, and that shift happening right at this period of time, 1909 to 1916, is very crucial. There's so much to say about this, because the reason why I leave this off at 1916 is because of World War I. Obviously, this is the end of Christy Mathewson, the end of the icon who defines this period of time, I would say, in large part. It is the end of this idea of kind of American isolationism, right? You have this American kind of agrarian, dysfunctional, to say the least, vision of the country, which is broken up. Its nationalism is broken up by the globalizing conflict of World War I. And you break at that point. You come back. You have these war-shortened seasons, and you have the Black Sox scandal, and then you have Ray Chapman, and the game is forever changed. Right? It's gone. Dead ball's gone. And the culture of everything that comes with that. So you're looking at a shift, like the foundational shift of what America was, being confronted with a new paradigm that I would say we really are still in. It's just been technologized. The new paradigm being mass industrialization and globalization. that just continues to build and transform. Um, and so it's just this strange moment where there are photographs, right? There are baseball cards. There's a proliferation of images that allow us to access this period of time. Um, but this period of time was neither here nor there. It was neither the pre-modern kind of Victorian history of baseball, which was defined by lithographs and illustrations and maybe cabinet photos. Um, I mean, the styles are completely different. It's mustaches. It's these very kind of Victorian baseball outfits. It's almost unrelatable. And it's not that. It's this very scrappy, gritty, proto-industrial um, emergence of modernity, and you can see it through baseball. So it's very powerful. I think this has been a pretty good summary. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next one.